All right, then. It's so exciting to be here, and thank you so much for coming out. This has been wonderful. I'm not pretending that you're here for me, but I'm just saying.
We're here for Gwen. We're here for Gwen.
That you've come. I'm going to begin with a little bit of an intro, and John's going to help me out, and then we're going to be off and running, okay? So let's start with the intro, which is, there will never, ever, ever, never, okay, be enough said about fathers and sons. People have sung any number of songs about fathers and sons. I recommend Cat Stevens, who's the Yusuf Islam, and people have written any number of books about fathers and sons. Ivan Turgenev, of course, wrote the great Russian novel Fathers and Sons, which I also recommend. Now, think about this. Add a senior and a junior to this relationship, and it becomes much more complicated. Two men sharing the same name, the same identity. Now add the fact that the father created the name that the two share, and the boy, the son, who's, what, let me ask you, who's gonna call the psychiatrist first, right? Right, so Jonathan Eich has written a book about Martin Luther King Jr. that frames much of his story around the context of Jr.'s relationship with his father, the Reverend Martin Luther King Sr. They both were born Michael. That's what their name was, Michael. And they both became Martin Luther. As the saying goes, to be a man, you've got to see a man. And what Martin Jr. saw was a powerful, intelligent, and complicated model of manhood with whom he had much in common. But while both were fathers to their own sons and to their congregations, Jonathan Eich makes plain that only Junior could have been a founding father of the nation. And so I'm going to ask him to read a little bit for us.
Thank you.
Oh, actually, you know what? Before he's going to read a little bit, I need to add one more thing. He has described Martin Luther King Jr.'s relationship with his dad as a central reason why we're all sitting here together in this room, in this southern city today. Bayard Rustin, the social activist, friend, and creative mind behind the 1963 March on Washington, he saw the relationship up close, and he and others came to see the tensions, the fear, and the love between these two men as what had to happen to forge the particular personality that Martin Jr. had that made him as effective as he became in the campaign for racial equality. So now, I hand it off to John.
All right. Rustin was fascinated by the father-son push and pull, the ways ML both feared and measured himself against Daddy King, the way Daddy King, even now, tried to bully his son, and the way ML still sought to establish his independence without angering his father. Years later, the black psychologist Kenneth Clark, who knew the King family personally, would become convinced that Martin Luther King Jr.'s approach to nonviolent resistance and love of one's enemies grew in part from his desire for self-protection from his father. The King children seldom won arguments with Daddy King. The fear of confrontation would turn the youngest of the King children, A.D., into a heavy drinker, like his grandfather, Jim King, and render sister Christine meek and submissive, as M.L. once said. Only Coretta had the courage to argue with her father-in-law. M.L., meanwhile, had learned to avoid fights by ending conversations inconclusively. In this case, he told his father, he would pray, and then he would do what he had to do.
Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm hand for the reading and writing skills of Jonathan Eich.
Thanks, Gwen.
Oh boy! Now the thing about it is, this, this relationship, it does hang over the book, even after. Junior has to walk his path alone without his father. But what makes it so interesting, Junior, I'm calling him that, like as if he's my friend, Junior, but Martin Luther King Jr.'s approach, which is to leave a conversation not having disagreed openly or in any way without listening to his father, but being comfortable with uncertainty. You know, letting the conversation trail off, letting the sentence trail off. I've heard you, but I'm going to have to pray on it, and then I'll do what I have to do. But you know, it seems to me, though, that that the ability to live with uncertainty like that and to be comfortable in uncertain moments is vital to survival for anyone.
Yeah, especially when you're taking on this job that King has thrust himself into, where there is no blueprint, where there is no job description, where there's no idea what's going to happen next. And it's really interesting you put it that way, because I've thought a lot about the fact that King is someone who does not really seem to like conflict, and that stems from his relationship with his father. And it's so interesting to think that our greatest protest leader is someone who doesn't like conflict, right? That would seem to be a bad fit for the job. And yet, he has to be prepared for accepting the unknown, for throwing himself into these chaotic situations, for living without resolution, because so much of his job depends on just being willing to do the uncomfortable, to throwing himself into protest movements where there's no plan for how they're going to end, just knowing that he has to engage and has to hope that there will be a positive outcome without knowing what that outcome might be. And that does connect to feeling like there's no point in arguing with my daddy, right?
That's absolutely true. And I have to say, one of the books that I strangely have read many, many times is the U.S. Army Survival Manual, right?
Really?
Yeah, I began to read that book right after Katrina, literally the day after Katrina. And because I happened to see it in a bookstore in Mississippi. I'd, evacuated there. And you know, that book lays out the 10 tenets of how to survive situations in which you've been isolated, or in which you're in terrible circumstances and you need to keep your head. And that's one of the main tenets, being able to live with uncertainty.
Wow.
Yeah.
And it's true for King over and over again, not just in engaging in these protests, but also in going to jail 29 times. And going to jail 29 times, knowing that he was effective in jail, but knowing that his life was always in danger in jail. And Ralph Abernathy talked about this a lot, and I interviewed Ralph's wife, Juanita, and she said that he was deathly afraid every single time. It wasn't like going to jail is just a political stunt. He knows he's effective in there because the world pays more attention when he's locked up, but he also seriously has to fear that he might not come out. Because when, especially black men in the South, disappeared into jail, they knew that they were subject to the whims of their oppressors, and that very often, another man done gone, right? That's the song that was inspired by the chain gangs, because men disappeared, and King knew that, so he had to accept that, even though he's thinking it's good for the movement, it'll be good for publicity, the New York Times will come down if I go to jail, but very real concern that he might not survive.
That he might not survive, exactly. And the thing about it is that, when you find yourself in a situation like that, the best thing that you can possibly do, and the thing that actually Dr. King did, was hedge bets, Yes, you don't know the day that you're going to be arrested, necessarily, but you do know that if you have your ducks in a row, you might be able to get out of it okay. And one of the things, I'm so glad that you mentioned Reverend Abernathy, who was a very close friend of Dr. King's in Alabama, because oftentimes the two men, from reading your book, I'm learning, oftentimes the two men actually conspired to be arrested together.
That's right.
Together. Because Abernathy, as you say, knew how terrified King was of being there.
Yeah, and it's one of the great acts of friendship. Abernathy understood his role as the second man, the man who didn't get the attention, the man who was there mostly to support King, also a brilliant preacher, also a brave activist, but he understood that part of what Martin needed was a companion, somebody to talk to, somebody to be with in jail, and that was one of the roles he willingly accepted, which is no small sacrifice.
It's true. And then, of course, Dr. King hedged his bets in other ways. I mean, he was so prepared to be able to state his case as to why he was there in Montgomery, why he was there in other cities, and what the purpose of the movement was in terms of racial equality, and of course the restoration of humanity for so many different people. But what was amazing, and I loved the detail that you mentioned in your book about Dr. King's strategies, which were about being able to talk about Niebuhr, the great, religious thinker, to be able to talk about Gandhi, but then also to be able to, to talk about forming birthday clubs, at the church in Montgomery, and figuring out little ways that could bring the community together so that, so that they were all stronger together.
Yeah,
right?
Right.
So talk about the birthday clubs and some of the other community building things he did.
Well, it's so important to remember, Gwen, thank you for asking that. It's so important to remember that he sees his role as being a preacher. And even as he gets swept up in this movement, and as he becomes famous and as he becomes a Nobel Prize winner, he keeps saying, it's over and over in interviews, I never sought out this job. I never wanted to be the leader of anything except my church. I'm a preacher, and this activism is just an outgrowth of my ministry. I have to do this now because I'm preaching to a larger audience. So when he moves to Montgomery, he sets up birthday clubs. He has this meeting with this congregation. He's 25 when he takes the job at Dexter Avenue. He's 26 when the Montgomery bus boycott begins, and he's thrust into this position of leadership. And he has to convince these old church members that they should take him seriously, because he's also, he's young, he's baby-faced, he's 20, he's 5'7", he's my height. So a lot of people feel like, who is this kid? So he sets out these rules, and he says, I want to remind you, first of all, that the power of the minister of this church stems from the congregation, but it's not a two-way relationship. I'm in charge here. The power also stems from God. So don't mess with me, basically, he's saying. But he's very modest, and he's setting up these birthday clubs, which is, whatever month you're born, you're assigned to a club. So all the October birthdays are part of a club, and they're meant to do social activities together, and each club is meant to raise a certain amount of money for the church.
So April will compete against August.
Right. He's playing them against each other, and but it's also a way for the members of the church to become more of a community. And that's really as far as his ambition stems until, Rosa Parks gets involved, and suddenly, but this gets back to the other point you were making about his message, about his combining these words of the church and the message of democracy that, and Niebuhr and Gandhi and all of these elements come together because he's been educated, he's been to seminary, he understands the South, he's born in Atlanta, but he's been educated in the North, and then all of a sudden, on December 5th, 1955, with 20 minutes to prepare, he has to give this speech to the people who've been boycotting the buses for one day.
For one day.
For one day. And they asked this young preacher to speak to the audience, to speak to the thousands of people who were gathering at Holt Street Baptist Church, to say, we need to convince them to stay off the bus for at least another day. And how long can we stay off the buses? How long is it going to take? And nobody knows that it's going to take 381 days. But they need somebody to inspire the crowd to stay off the buses for one more day or 2 more days. And they asked this kid, Martin Luther King Jr., because nobody's heard of him, because he hasn't made any enemies in town yet, because he has a reputation for being a pretty good speaker, and because the women who actually organized the bus boycott, well, they're not going to be asked to lead because that's just the world we're living in 1955. But King steps up to that microphone. First he has a panic attack.
Yes.
Can't breathe, can't think. Now 10 minutes of his 20 minutes are gone.
Preparing for the speech.
Preparing for this speech.
Yes.
And he gets up there and he says to this crowd spontaneously, what we're here for tonight is serious business. And if we are wrong in demanding justice, if we are wrong in suggesting that it's the black people of America who might teach the rest of this country what democracy really means, if we are wrong in demanding justice, then the Constitution is wrong. The Supreme Court of the United States is wrong. The Holy Bible is wrong, and God Almighty is wrong. And that message, which came to him spontaneously, rooted in everything he'd been taught growing up as a black man in America and as a doctoral student at Boston, all of that just came out. And that's when he becomes Martin Luther King Jr. That's when he finds the message that will really change him from being the guy who's worried about the birthday clubs to being worried about all of society. Now he has to save the whole country's soul.
That's right. That's right. And all. But in many ways, you're right. He's finding his own voice, and he's finding a voice that is in many ways informed by his father, but distinct from his father.
Oh, yeah.
He is a more refined version of Martin Luther King Sr. Martin Luther King Sr. was known to be a very emotional, emotive preacher.
That's right.
He was known to walk through the congregation as he preached and freak the crap out of people.
Stomping and shouting and hollering, and it would embarrass his son.
Yes.
ML would say he was embarrassed by his father's style of preaching.
Mm-hmm. But the father also had ingenious ways of creating community within his church as well. He had come from a relatively popular church in Atlanta when his father-in-law had died,
right.
and he went and took over Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, which was his wife's father's church, and then he figured out ways to make that church into a huge success. Right. So the son is really sort of borrowing from the old man, but at the same time, creating a polish that the old man did not have that could reach so many other people.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's that polish that is partly why he's discovered in the North, why the media falls in love with him, and why he becomes, from Montgomery, the leading symbol of this new movement, and why people start, like Bayard Rustin, start flocking to Montgomery and saying, we got to take this magic that this kid's found and help share it around the country, help spread it around the country. And suddenly they're saying to King, we need you to do this again and again and again and help us take this movement national. And King's like, what am I supposed to do now, right? There's no plan for this.
Right.
And again, it's inspired by his father. His father's clearly paving the way, but it's also, as you said, an attempt to improve on his father, to take it to the next level, to see what he can do that his father, couldn't have dreamed of. It's
true, and the thing about it is that both men had extraordinary charm. It takes you a while in your book to mention the fact that the father was actually quite good. He was something of a womanizer. He was good with women.
Yes, that's.
And Martin Luther King Jr. was pretty good with women. Even as a very young man, before he ever married. And he dressed beautifully, he spoke beautifully, he had a beautiful smile, he was very charismatic. But one of the best pickup lines I think I've ever read, right? And I don't know if you could, I doubt you could do it today. Probably you couldn't really pull it off today. But my favorite was, he's in Boston, he sees this woman, he starts talking to her, and then he says, she says, well, what are you doing? And he says, I'm gonna kill Jim Crow.
Yeah.
I'm going to kill Jim Crow. Damn.
Yeah, that's pretty good. His other pickup line, which I've used all the time, was he went up to the woman in the cafeteria. I interviewed this woman who he dated. He said, I see you don't like beets either. He had mood, he had style, no question about it.
He had range.
I have to tell you, speaking of Daddy King and the philandering, I interviewed 200 people for this book. One of my favorite interviews with June Dobbs Butts, who grew up with King on Auburn Avenue. And
in Atlanta. Yeah.
In Atlanta. And her dad was like the unofficial mayor of Auburn Avenue. And they knew Daddy King really well. And June would go home every day with King after school, and they would have their favorite snack that King's housekeeper would prepare for them. It was white bread with butter and sugar sprinkled on top. And when they were teenagers, June's sister was dating King, and later June's best friend became engaged to King, and she said when they were freshmen in college, they did a summer internship together, and they would spend every day together talking, sitting under the tree. They would have a lunch break, and King would talk about the fact that he didn't want to be like his dad. He didn't want to be a philanderer. He wanted to find one woman and
be true.
And be true. And June just laughed. She said, that was never true a moment in his life. He never managed to pull off the monogamy thing.
But he always felt bad about it.
He felt bad about it. It's true. And, so I found in my research Daddy King's unpublished autobiography.
Yes.
And the other thing that I found was tapes that Coretta made when she began working on her memoir in 1968, just months after the assassination. And on these tapes she made with her ghostwriter for the memoir, the tapes were at the archives at the University of Florida. Nobody had ever asked to hear them before. And on these tapes, she talks about the fact that she discovered that he was cheating on her while they were engaged, which is, just mind-blowing. And, she accepted a lot and tolerated and put up with a lot. But to know that even before you're married, that this is what you're getting into, it's just really sad.
She was a very interesting woman, and I'll never forget when she died. President Clinton spoke at her funeral, and he was not the first speaker. There had been lots of other speakers that day, and they had talked about her contributions to the civil rights movement, and just the magic that this woman. Was responsible for in being part of this family, and and the fact that she was just as big a drum major for peace as anybody else in the movement. And then President Clinton got up and he said, "I hope you all don't forget that there's a woman in this box." And that's and this is what you're talking about, sort of like getting at the private challenges that Coretta Scott, experienced, not only during the relationship, but after the relationship, after her husband's death.
Yeah, one of my really important goals with this book was to give Coretta the three-dimensional treatment that she deserves. She still hasn't had a proper biography written about her. And I thought it was so important to present her story in as much light as possible because, as you said, she was very much more than the housewife. She was the real inspiration. And one of the things that I talked to some of the women who King dated was the fact that he chose Coretta because she was an activist. She had more experience as an activist than he did when they met.
She had gone to Antioch.
She'd gone to Antioch. She'd been involved in all of these protests on campus. The school wouldn't let black students do their student teaching in white schools. She was protesting that. There was a barber shop in town that wouldn't cut black people's hair. She protested that. She went to the Progressive Party National Convention. So when she meets King on this date, and he uses his lines on her, I don't know about the Beats line or not, but he definitely used that "I'm going to kill Jim Crow" line. Yeah. Her first reaction was, "What a load of jive." But what she began to realize was that he was interested in her because of her career in activism. That's what made her stand out from all the other women he was dating. I'll tell you one more funny thing. All the women I interviewed who dated King said there were two initial observations when they met him. He was really short, but he had a car.
That's right, including people who maybe didn't date him, because I learned from your book that Sybil Moriel was also in Boston at that time, studying at Boston University, and she said he was the one with the car.
So that's a good way to be popular.
It's a great way to be popular, it really is. But just as you read earlier, Coretta was also strong enough to stand up to his father.
Right.
In ways that he could not.
Absolutely.
And that took guts because Martin Luther King Jr.'s mother didn't stand up to her husband. I mean, she persuaded him in other ways, but Coretta could actually stand up. And you talk about Harry Belafonte, his take on Coretta as saying that she was stately and cold, was it? Stately and cold.
Yeah.
But sometimes you need to be stately and cold in those situations.
Yeah, and stately and cold is often described. That's for men that can be seen as an attribute, right?
Absolutely.
Tough, disciplined, no funny business, right? But for women that we turn that into a negative. But yeah, Belafonte wasn't a big fan of Coretta's, actually.
He was not. But what was also interesting is that, in many ways, there was something unchanging about her, which I guess maybe, is related to the stately part. There's something unchanging about, and I remember, growing up, and every time I thought I maybe needed a haircut, I would say to somebody, "Am I doing like a Coretta Scott King thing?" Because her hair never changed, like her hair never changed. But
I got no problem with that personally.
Exactly. No, but what's also interesting is that people, and I hate to say this, but Kenny Rogers might have said it best.
How many times do I hear that a day?
But, in that song, The Coward of the County, which is a great song, actually. It's very popular all over the world. And it's a story about a kid whose father advised him not to fight back. And then, he had a girlfriend, Becky, and these guys treated Becky wrong, and then he goes into a saloon, and the boys are all there, and they're all laughing at him like a coward, and then the line in the song is, but you could have heard a pin drop when Tommy locked the door, and then of course Tommy wipes the floor with these guys, right? So all of this is building to the fact that King could stand up when pushed to confrontation. And I want you to do another reading for us. And this one involves confrontation at pretty much the highest level of his work, right? Let me find the page for you.
Can I just say, Gwen Thompkins is one of the greatest interviewers in America.
I want to bend him to my will. Oh boy, now where did I put it?
Cat Stevens, Kenny Rogers, Daddy King. Nobody else has this repertoire.
Oh my gosh. Well, it was a good song. Here we go. Okay, here we go. Now you have to set it up for us. Okay. And it starts here.
Okay. I don't know what I'm setting up exactly.
You're setting up the reason for the meeting.
Oh, well, this is after the Birmingham jail. After King's letter from the Birmingham jail had really, King over and over just sees his job as like shining a bright light in our faces and making us stare at the things we don't want to stare at, like making us pay attention to the racism that so many Americans are trying to ignore. And that's what the letter from Birmingham jail is about. That's what the protests in Birmingham are about. And that's what the March on Washington is going to be about. We're setting that up here. We just have to stay in the faces of President Kennedy and Robert F. Kennedy and the American public and the media. We just have to keep shining that light until they acknowledge that we're here and we're not going away. And it's important to remember that by this time King knows that Bobby Kennedy has authorized wiretaps on members of his closest some of his closest associates, and will later authorize wiretaps on King's own home and office. So this is the part in the book where I think it's we're getting ready for the march. Is there anything else you wanted me to say before?
No,
okay.
Go ahead.
On May 24th, Robert Kennedy, at the prompting of James Baldwin, met with a group of black artists and writers at the Kennedy family's apartment at 24 Central Park South in Manhattan. Those in attendance included Harry Belafonte, Lena Horne, Lorraine Hansberry, Clarence Jones, Kenneth B. Clark, Edwin C. Berry of the Union League, and Jerome Smith, a freedom rider and Corps field worker. After Smith described what he had experienced and complained that he didn't know how much longer he could remain nonviolent, the meeting became antagonistic. The Attorney General took it personally. He said he had come seeking ideas, not attacks. But the dialogue went on 3 hours, stopping suddenly out of sheer exhaustion, as the historian Arthur M. Schlesinger put it. Bobby didn't understand our urgency, Baldwin said later, adding that Kennedy didn't understand the depth of the problem, and our apprehension of his misunderstanding made it very tense and finally very ugly. If we couldn't make the Attorney General of the United States, who was a fairly young and intelligent man, understand the urgency of the black situation, then there wasn't any hope at all. Though Kennedy resented the way he was treated, Schlesinger said, the group's message got through to him. He began, I believe, to grasp, as from the inside, the nature of black anguish, Schlesinger wrote.
So amazing. I mean, sometimes things have to get ugly.
Yeah.
And this section really sort of captures the fact that the civil rights leaders were between, very conservative white supremacists who they were dealing with in the South, as well as, in many ways, tone-deaf white liberals from the North, who had good intentions, but who were not able to easily integrate or grasp what the seriousness of the situation actually was.
That's right. And King is, again, we talked about putting himself into uncomfortable situations. He's knowingly and willingly putting himself in between all of these people who have different reasons not to want to hear him, not to want to listen to him, to complain about him. He's moving too slow for some of the black activists. He's moving much too fast for his white allies who keep telling him, just be patient, just be patient. And he sees his job as making people uncomfortable. And that means sometimes he's not really making anybody particularly happy. And that kind of strain, that kind of stress, and then to know that your own government, you're working to try to pass civil rights legislation with the president, and the president's attorney general is wiretapping your phones. And you know that, and you continue to do this. That's, to me, mind-boggling. And you can literally hear some of these phone conversations where Kennedy and King are on the phone, or Johnson and King are on the phone. We have recordings of some of these conversations. We have transcripts of a lot of King's conversations because the FBI was listening in. And you can read this constant struggle, this balance to try to push these people who are working with him, who are also, as he knows, undermining his work at the same time. And it's crazy. There's one conversation that with LBJ, this is fast forwarding a little bit, when Watts is on fire and an innocent black man has been shot and killed in his car and the city's burning, and King is told by his advisors, don't go there. You don't know Los Angeles. You're not going to be welcome there. It's already too violent. Preaching nonviolence is going to be a waste of time. He goes because this is his job. These are his people, and he believes in nonviolence, and you have to thrust yourself. And he goes and he gets abused by a lot of the angry people who are burning down neighborhoods. But he's there and he's listening, and he calls the president to tell him what he's seeing. And he's talking to LBJ. And you can actually listen to this phone call on the presidential website. And he says, you don't understand, Mr. President, this is not just an isolated incident. Police brutality is a huge problem throughout the nation, and it's been going on a long time. That's why this is blowing up now. And the job situation, all these other things are contributing to it. We need to really address the fundamental causes of poverty and police brutality. We need to get at the core of this. And Johnson on the phone seems to be so engaged and so interested and so thankful to King for being there. And as I'm listening to this conversation, all I can think is, this is the time, Dr. King, to ask him to get the FBI off your damn back. Like, that's what any normal person dealing with politicians would do, right? Like, I'm here helping you. By the way, my job would be a lot easier in preaching nonviolence and fighting for civil rights legislation and trying to make our democracy more complete if my own government wasn't surveilling me and stalking me and planting bugs in my hotel rooms. Get J. Edgar Hoover off my back. But King doesn't even think that way because he doesn't think like a politician.
He doesn't think like a politician, but at the same time, everybody was so afraid of Hoover. I mean, even LBJ was afraid of Hoover.
Yes.
And so, it's almost as if that's the big bad wolf that nobody can vanquish, But I get your point, definitely. And the thing is, what I think that, what's also happening is that, the frustration of trying to explain to someone why the stakes are so high, why there's urgency, why we can't wait, in the words of Dr. King, And, you mentioned in your reading earlier about Lena Horne being in that meeting. And I once talked to a man not that long ago who lives in New Orleans, and he was telling me, he said, Lena Horne bought a car up in upstate New York for SNCC to use, the Student Nonviolent, Committee, and I had to drive that car from Utica, New York, down to Mississippi, and I drove the car down, and I was exhausted by the time I got to Mississippi, and really needed a place to stay, but nobody, I was really concerned about having New York plates on the car, and ultimately a white kid helped me. I got a white airman from the Keesler Air Force Base who was thumbing a ride to drive the car while I slept. And he goes, and then I finally, I gave I handed the car off, and I came back to New Orleans. And within a few days, I'm outside on my lawn, and my wife calls me and says, come inside, come inside. And he comes inside, he's on TV, that the same guy that he gave the keys to was part of that group of 3 boys who were now missing.
Oh, wow.
In Mississippi. They were, they were trying to register people to vote. Cheney and
Goodman
and yeah. He had given the keys to Cheney.
Wow.
And all he could think about as we were standing on the phone was, it could have been me.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It could have been me. And then and this is how many years later? And there's this long pause on the phone, like maybe more than a minute. And he goes, well, I guess we can talk another time, you know? And so the truth of the matter is, like, and your book does this so beautifully, you capture the psychic fatigue of this kind of work. Every aspect of it, right? And that psychic fatigue is something that MLK felt very, very strongly.
Yeah.
Really.
One of the bizarre, unintended consequences of the FBI wiretaps is that, and it was meant to destroy him. I mean, literally, they tried to destroy him. They took a compilation of the tapes that they made in his hotel rooms and they sent it to his home, knowing that his wife would hear it, with a note purporting to be from an anonymous black man saying that you're going to be exposed for this behavior that's on these tapes if you don't commit suicide, with a date by which they expected him to commit suicide. But one of the strange twists of history is that those tapes now really help to humanize King, because we can hear his voice, we can read his words on the phones with his closest friends and associates saying, I feel like no one's listening to me anymore. I feel like I don't understand why the press has turned on me. And as his own government is surveilling him and he feels like the public is, it's important to remember that by 1966, two-thirds of all Americans said they disapproved of Martin Luther King. We celebrate him now with a national holiday. We forget how unpopular he was. We forget how radical he was. We forget how religious he was. We forget how often he failed. We forget how frustrated he felt at the end of his life. And we forget that he only grew more radical as all of that was happening. That when the government tried to shut him down, he went even bigger. He said, I'm going to go north. I'm going to talk about the fact that northern racism is just as bad as southern racism, just better disguised. I'm going to attack the Vietnam War because I can't ask you to put out the fires, and you can't ask me to put out the fires in Los Angeles without talking about the fact that the American government is the greatest purveyor of violence on earth in Vietnam. So he doubles down over and over again, but we can read these transcripts of these phone conversations and see how difficult it was, how much he was suffering. The one that gets me the most, that I still get goosebumps, he gives what I consider the greatest speech of his life on May 4th, 1967, Riverside Church in New York, exactly a year before his assassination. And he sums up his entire life's philosophy. He talks about why his faith, his belief in God and Jesus, compels him to speak out on these issues, that no matter how unpopular it may be. And that it doesn't matter if he loses support, that he has to speak out, or else everything he's ever done is hypocrisy. And the next day, he gets a call from one of his closest friends, somebody who's been with him for decades. And his friend, who's a member of the movement, is active in the SCLC, says, boy, I really wish you hadn't given that speech last night, because it's going to really hurt our fundraising. It's going to really damage our ability to work in the North. It's going to hurt our relationship with the president. And King has to explain to one of his best friends, we know exactly what he said because we have the transcript of the conversation, thanks to the FBI. He says, don't you know me by now? What I said yesterday may have been politically unwise, but it was not morally unwise.
I love that. He talked about the moral beauty of the cause. Moral beauty. I'd never thought of to put those two words together, moral beauty. And it's very true. But I have to say, we don't have a whole lot more time, but I want to get to this one last part. And I think that we should come clean, John. John and I used to work together at the Times-Picayune many, many years ago. And we actually took ballroom dance together.
And your feet are still hurting, I'm sure. You got the bruises to show for it.
But it was true to John's character that he kept up with the classes because they interfered with his basketball schedule, right? But he took, I thought it was really sweet that you did that.
We had a good time.
But the thing is, so we've been talking over the last months about the book and all. We want to do a podcast at some point about it. I think it could be really great. And so one of the ideas that we had was to do like a little radio show about fatigue, because so much of what King faced in his life was so sapping to the soul. But the truth of the matter is, this is a universal condition for a lot of people who are doing good work. I mean, we only have to think of the most recent news of Alexei Navalny's
Right.
death to see, you know what I mean, what the toll can be of doing good work and all. And so one day we're going to have to do that. But in the meantime, I want you to read what I think is just the best juxtaposition between like how crappy you can feel and at the same time how far you can go. Okay.
Thanks. Utterly exhausted, yet unable to sleep, King, on October 13th, 1964, checked into St. Joseph's Infirmary in Atlanta, where he swallowed a sleeping pill and finally fell into slumber. Coretta called the next morning to tell him he'd won the Nobel Peace Prize. "I thought I was still asleep," King told reporters from his hospital bed, where he allowed photographers to snap pictures as a nurse checked his temperature. "For a moment, I thought it was all a dream." When Coretta and a few of her closest aides, Andrew Young, Dora MacDonald, and Bernard Lee, joined him in the hospital room, he asked them to join him in prayer and pointed out that the Nobel would require them all to work harder than ever. He soon dressed and used the hospital's auditorium for a press conference, explaining to reporters that he'd been hospitalized for fatigue as well as a lingering virus. Doctors had also told him he was 20 pounds overweight and suffering high blood pressure. "I do not consider this merely an honor to me personally, but a tribute to the discipline, wise restraint, and majestic courage of the millions of gallant Negroes and white persons of goodwill who have followed a rule of love," he said, adding that he intended to donate every penny of the $54,000 award to the civil rights movement. At age 35, he was the youngest person ever to receive the Nobel Prize, the first American and Southerner, and the second African American.
Thirty-five,
35.
hypertensive, in the hospital, and he's still hitting it out of the park. Yeah?
Yeah, and I think that the message, as you said, is that, it feels like it's really hard these days not to lose hope. But if King could keep going, then we can too.
Absolutely. And so let me ask you one last question that is, it might be a little bit more personal, even more personal than the Foxtrot. And that is, you dedicate this book to someone called Jeffrey. Who's Jeffrey? And why does this book speak so clearly to him?
Well, I don't know if he's read it, but Jeffrey's my son. I was in the Big Brother program, met him when he was 7 years old, and his mom passed away when he was 14, and he became part of our family. And he's now 33 years old, and just called me like an hour ago. I talk to him every day, and he's married, and he's just one of the great blessings of my life.
And what do you, if he ever should read the book, what do you hope he'll take away from the book and from his, this weird set of circumstances that landed him as your son?
Yeah, he grew up, in a tough situation, and he's made the best of it, and he's suffered a lot. And I just feel like it's the same message that I would hope any of us takes away from reading a book about King, or really reading any book, like that. We can learn through other people's lives how to be better and how to be a better part of a community and how to love one another, and to remember that no matter how much struggle and strife and difference there may be among us, that we're all children of God, we're all on the planet together, and we have to share and get along, and that we can.
Thank you, John I.
Thanks.